Nobody wanted the drive-in. That was the whole reason he left it to her. At 69, 9 days after she buried her husband, Ivy Bledsoe sat in a lawyer's office off the county square that smelled of old paper and floor wax, and listened to a stranger read out the division of 27 years of her life. When it was finished, Otis Bledsoe's son and daughter had the brick house on Chandler Street, the crossroads acreage, the trucks, the accounts, and the money. And Ivy had 11 acres of broomsedge on a bypassed stretch of old Highway 9, with a dead movie screen standing up out of the middle of it. Mac made a sound when the lawyer read that part, a short breath through the nose that in a warmer man might have passed for a laugh, and in Mac was only arithmetic. Cherie looked out the window at nothing in particular, and Ivy, who had not yet let herself weep anywhere the family could keep a tally of it, folded her copy of the deed into her handbag and thanked them, quietly, for the ride back out to the highway. What none of them knew, not Mac, not Cherie, not the neighbors who shook their heads over the meanness of it, not Ivy herself, standing in the wet grass that evening, looking up at the great peeling face of the screen, was that the Brightleaf Drive-In had not gone one single day without electricity since the summer of 1988. The picture had stopped. The meter had not. To understand what that meant, and why a man would pay for 38 years to keep the current on at a theater that never once opened its gate in all that time, you have to go back to a Tuesday in the fall, and a funeral almost nobody in Aldrich, North Carolina, expected to be so poorly attended. Otis Bledsoe died at 79, in his chair, with the radio on, and the church held maybe 40 people. Ivy had expected more. She had spent 31 years feeding this county through the plate lunch window at the Aldrich Mill canteen, and she knew every face in that room by the way it took its cornbread. And sitting in the second pew, she did what she had always done, counting heads, thinking, in portions, and the number she came to was 40, and it was not enough. Otis had been in everybody's life for 60 years, the boy who swept the booth, then the man in the little lit window who made Saturday night happen, and 40 people came. But that was Otis. He had been quiet the way a wall is quiet. He did not join, did not run for anything, did not tell stories about himself. In 27 years of marriage, Ivy had watched him say more to a projector than he ever said to a room. He had a 9th grade education and a jeweler's touch, and he could hear a sprocket going out of true through a closed door. The one thing anybody could quote him on was a line he said once a year, in October, on the first cold Saturday, standing at the booth window with nobody but Ivy in the field to hear it. Nobody is gone while the reel is still turning. She had always taken it for what it sounded like, an old projectionist being sentimental about his trade. She never once thought to ask what he meant. That was the shape of their marriage. She talked, he listened, and every so often he said a thing like that and let it lie there like a stone in a creek and went back to work. The reading of the will was 9 days later. Curtis Pate read it flat, the way a man reads a grocery list, and Ivy sat with her handbag in her lap and her back very straight and understood by the second paragraph exactly what was happening to her. The house to Mac and Cherie, the crossroads acreage to Mac and Cherie, the trucks to Mac. The accounts divided 27 years, and her name did not appear until the 4th page, and when it did, it was attached to the one thing on that list everybody in the room had spent their whole lives driving past without seeing. The 11 acres at Brightleaf, Curtis Pate read, the structures standing upon it, and every last thing stored inside them, whatever it turns out to be. Nobody heard the last clause. Ivy did not hear it either. Mac made his sound. Cherie kept looking out the window. Curtis Pate turned the page and went on to the disposition of a savings bond, and the moment passed over that room like weather over a field, and the only person in the county who would have understood what had just been said out loud had been dead for 9 days. Afterward, In the parking lot, Mac was almost kind about it, which was worse. He stood by his truck with his keys in his hand and told her, in the tone of a man doing a woman a favor, that he would handle it. The screen was a liability, an attractive nuisance. Kids went out there, and if it came down in a storm, it would be her name on the paper. He could have a fellow out there with a track hoe for $6,000, less if they salvaged the block. It was weeds, he said. It's 11 acres of weeds and a broken movie screen, Ivy. Daddy was old. Daddy wasn't thinking. Cherie said nothing, which is its own kind of vote. And Ivy Bledsoe, who had spent 31 years handing plates through a window to men who talked to her exactly like that, said thank you and said she'd think on it, and drove out Old Highway 9 with the deed on the seat beside her, past the 4-lane exit and the shuttered mill with trees coming up through its loading dock, until the road narrowed and the world got quiet. And there it was on the left where it had been her entire life, a ticket booth like a phone booth made of block, a chain across a gap in a fence, 11 acres of dry broomsedge going gold in the last of the light, rows of leaning, rusted speaker posts standing in it like a congregation nobody had dismissed, and at the far end 60 feet of screen tower, cinder-block at the base, weathered plank and steel above, its white face peeling off in flakes the size of dinner plates, rust bleeding down it in long streaks, one corner of its frame bent, where a storm in the 90s had gotten hold of it, and not quite finished the job. It was, Ivy thought, standing there with the chain in her hand, the ugliest thing she had ever been given. She was 69 years old. She had a room at her sister's for as long as she wanted it, and a pension that would cover a small apartment in town. She had, in point of fact, nowhere to be. And what she felt, standing in that gap in the fence, was not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but a flat, cold, level clarity, which is what grief and anger make when you have been raised not to raise your voice. They had given her the joke of the county. Fine, it was hers. She unhooked the chain and drove in. The concession stand sat low and square in the middle of the field, a block building with a flat roof and a rolling steel shutter, and, behind it, the booth, one room up a set of steel stairs, with a slot of a window facing the screen. Ivy went through her husband's key ring in the dying light and found the padlock's key third try, and shouldered the door and stood in the dark breathing the smell of it. Dust, old popcorn oil gone past rancid into something almost sweet. Mouse, cold block, and under all of it, faint and to her entirely unfamiliar, the sharp, clean chemical smell of a place that had been kept. She did not know that was what she was smelling. Not yet. She reached along the block wall for a switch because a person's hand does that, whether the building is alive or not, and she found one, and she flipped it. And the lights came on. Ivy Bledsoe stood in the middle of a dead theater on a bypassed highway, with her hand still on the switch, looking up at a bare bulb burning steady in a wire cage over a counter where nobody had sold a Coca-Cola in 38 years. And the first thought she had, the very first one, before grief and before hope and before any of the rest of it, was the plain flat accountant's thought of a woman who had run a canteen on a budget for 3 decades. Somebody, she thought, is paying for this. She moved in on a Thursday. It was not a decision so much as a series of small refusals that added up to one. She did not call Mac back about the track hoe. She did not look at the apartment over the flower shop. She took her sister's spare cot, the hot plate out of her own kitchen that Mac's wife had already put a sticker on, and the quilt off the bed she had shared with Otis for 27 years, and carried them one at a time through the door of a concession stand on a bypassed highway. Her sister cried on the phone and said, "Ivy, you cannot live in a snack bar." Ivy said she was not living in one. She was cleaning one, and hung up, and stood a while with her hand flat on the cold counter, because she was in fact living in a snack bar and both of them knew it. She started the way she had always started, which was at the far corner with a bucket. The first week she did not think about the will at all, or she told herself she did not. She thought about grease. The concession stand had 38 years of it, gone amber and then brown, and then to something like varnish over the block and the steel and the underside of the counter, and Ivy went at it with degreaser and a green pad and a putty knife. On her knees. An hour, 2 hours, resting, going again, the way a woman works who has cooked for 400 men a day and knows exactly how much of. Herself an hour costs. She found a mouse nest in the coin drawer of the ticket booth, made entirely of shredded ticket stubs, 40 years of red-numbered tickets chewed into a soft gray ball, and she carried the drawer out and set it in the grass and let the mouse keep it. At night she ran an extension cord to the cot and listened to the field. The broomsedge moved constantly, a dry hushing that went on like a crowd waiting for something, and twice a night a truck came down Old Highway 9, doing 60, and its headlights swept the screen, and for half a second the whole great peeling face of it lit up white and enormous over her, and went dark again. She had never, once, in 27 years, come out here with him. That was the thing she kept arriving at, lying on a cot in her husband's dead theater. He came out here. Not often, but regularly, the way other men went to the lodge, gone 3 hours on a Saturday, back with his hands smelling of oil, saying he'd been out to the Brightleaf, and she'd say that's nice. And that was all. She had asked, the first year, whether he wanted to open it back up, and he had looked at her with an expression she could not read then and could not read now, and said, "No, Ivy." And she had let it be. That was how they worked. And now she lay in the dark, and understood that she had been married 27 years to a man who drove out here every few weeks to do something in a field she had never once asked about. The second week, the neighbor came. She was up on the counter with a scraper when she heard the tractor, and by the time she got to the door there was an old man on an old Ford with a bush hog on the back, idling in the gap in the fence, waiting to be told to come in or told to go. Ephraim Sills, everybody called him Eph, 74, farmed the ground across the highway, a face like a walnut and a cap advertising a fertilizer company that had not existed since the 80s. He did not offer condolences right off. He looked at the field first, a long professional look, the way a man looks at his own work. "Getting away from me," he said. "I'm 2 weeks behind." It was the funeral, and then it was wet. Ivy stood in the doorway with the scraper still in her hand and said the only thing she could think of, which was, "Behind on what?" And Eph Sills looked at her the way you look at somebody who has asked what color the sky is. "The mowing," he said. Ivy came down off the step into the gravel. Around her, in every direction, 11 acres of broomsedge stood dry and gold, and about 1.5 feet high, and, she saw it now, with a suddenness that made her put her hand on the block wall. Perfectly. Deliberately, even. Not weeds. Not a field gone back. A field somebody had been cutting. She had walked it every day for 2 weeks and had seen exactly what Mac told her she would see, because a person mostly sees the thing they have been handed the word for. "How long?" she said. Eph pushed his cap back. "Every 3rd Saturday," he said. "March to November. Since about 95, 96. 30 years. He agreed that it was about 30 years. Ivy asked him why, and Eph Sills said the sentence that turned the whole thing over, and he said it mildly, and he said it while looking at his mower deck and not at her, and he had no idea in the world that he was saying anything at all. "Otis asked me to," he said. $40. He never said what for, and I never asked him. He paid it in cash every November, and one time I tried to give it back on account of it wasn't hardly worth his money, and he wouldn't take it. He said keep it mowed to the tower. He said don't let anything get up against the tower. He looked up then. "A field don't stay mowed by itself," he said, and put the tractor in gear. Ivy stood in the gravel a long time after the sound of him faded toward the far corner. 30 years of $40 every third Saturday, March to November, 18 cuttings a year, she did the arithmetic standing still, because she had done arithmetic standing still for 31 years. Something on the order of $21,000, spent quietly, in cash, by a man who bought his work pants at the farm store, to keep the grass down on 11 acres that the entire county, including his own son, including his own wife, had agreed for 38 years was worth nothing at all. Don't let anything get up against the tower. She turned and looked, for the first time, not at the screen, but at the base of it, at the block, and even from 300 feet away. Across the mown gold of a field she had been told was weeds, she could see that there was a door in it. She walked out to it through the mown field with the light going long and orange behind her, and the tower got bigger the way big things do. Not steadily, but in jumps, until she was standing under it and it was not a movie screen anymore at all. It was a building, 60 feet of it, and the bottom 15 were solid cinder block, painted white a very long time ago and gone the gray-green of an old fence rail, and set into the back of it, facing away from the field, away from the highway, away from every direction anybody ever looked, was a steel door. She had lived in this county her whole life. She had been to the Brightleaf 100 times as a girl. She had never in her life thought about what was behind the screen, for the same reason nobody thinks about what is behind a wall. The door had a hasp on it, and Ivy looked at that hasp a long moment, because it was brass, and it was clean, and its screws were bright, and there was not one other bright screw on that entire property. Everything at the Brightleaf was 38 years dead. The fence sagged, the speaker posts leaned, the ticket booth had a mouse living in the money, and here at the back of the screen, where nobody had any occasion to walk, was a hasp and a padlock put on within the last few years by a man who bought his work pants at the farm store. She went through the key ring twice, 40 years of keys, and not one of them fit. That night, she went at his papers. She had one cardboard box of them, rescued out of the hall closet on Chandler Street the afternoon before Mac's wife came through with the stickers, and now she sat on the floor of the concession stand under the clip lamp and went through her husband's paper the way she had gone at the grease, methodically, not expecting to find anything. Tax paper, a truck title, his discharge, a 9th grade report card with a C in citizenship that made her laugh out loud alone in a dead building at 11 o'clock at night, and, at the bottom, banded in rubber that had gone to tar, an 1.5 inches of electric bills. She looked at the top one for a while without understanding it. Then she understood it, and the room went very still around her. The account was at the Brightleaf. The name on it was Otis Bledsoe, and it had been opened in 1953 by a man named Sutterth and transferred to Otis in 1979, and it had never, not for 1 month, not for 1 day, been closed. She went down through the stack. 1988, the summer the picture stopped. $11 and change. 1994, 16. 2006, $24.80. The last one, 3 weeks before he died, $33.09. Paid, all of them paid. Drafted automatically from an account at the credit union that Ivy had never heard of, that had never once appeared on any statement she had ever seen, that Otis had opened in his own name in 1988 and funded twice a year in cash. 38 years. 450 some months. Never late. Never lapsed. She did the arithmetic on the back of the chest freezer warranty because she had to put it somewhere, and the number came to a little over $14,000, spent one small monthly bite at a time, in secret, on nothing. Ivy sat on that floor with the bills in her lap and thought about the $40 every third Saturday and the $14,000 of electricity and the bright screws on a brass hasp at the back of a wall nobody ever walked behind. And she thought about a man who told her, when she asked if he wanted to open the drive-in back up, "No, Ivy," and let it lie there like a stone in a creek. And for the first time since the funeral, alone, with nobody in 11 acres to keep a tally of it, Ivy Bledsoe put her face in her hands and cried, and she could not have told anybody whether it was grief or fury, and it was both. He had left her something. She did not know what it was, but he had spent $14,000 and 38 years making sure it was still there. The fuse box was in the little office off the back of the concession stand. Behind the door she had propped open with a fire extinguisher on her first day and had not looked at since. Gray steel, painted over twice. She opened it at 7 the next morning with a cup of percolator coffee going cold behind her, and taped inside the door, under cellophane tape gone brittle and brown at the edges, was a card. An index card. Soft pencil. Block capitals, drawn slow and square by a man who did everything slow and square. It was a drawing of the tower, not a good drawing. A rectangle with a smaller rectangle at the bottom of it for the door, and a little box off to the side for the concession stand, and a line running between them for the buried feed, and an arrow, pressed so hard into the card that the pencil had scored it, pointing at the third breaker down on the south side of the panel. And under the arrow, 4 words and a name. South breaker, leave it on, Ivy. She put her hand out and touched the card and did not take it down. She looked at the panel. The third breaker on the south side was on. It had been on the entire time, all 38 years, humming quietly to itself behind a rusted steel door in a dead building while a county drove past on a bypassed highway and agreed, unanimously, that there was nothing out here. She looked at the tape. It was old, but it was not 38 years old. It was maybe 3 years old, and Ivy stood very still in that little office and thought about Curtis Pate saying the date of the instrument in his flat grocery list voice 3 years back, and Mac in the parking lot saying Daddy was old. Daddy wasn't thinking, and it occurred to her for the first time that her husband had been thinking exactly, precisely, and continuously for 38 years, and that the only person he had ever meant to explain any of it to was standing here right now with a cup of cold coffee, reading her own name off a card in a fuse box, which left the door, which left the key. The funeral home had given her a manila envelope on the day of the visitation, the kind with a string and a button closure, and printed across the front of it in a font meant to be gentle were the words "personal effects." Inside it was everything that had been in Otis Bledsoe's pockets when his heart stopped. She had not opened it. It had ridden in the glove box of his truck for a month and a half, because she could not open it and could not put it anywhere either. She sat in the cab in the mown field and unwound the string. 61 cents. A pocket knife with a bone handle worn to a shine on one side. A rubber band. His reading glasses, folded. A church bulletin from June with a phone number on it in his hand that turned out, later, to be a plumber. And a key ring. A little one. 2 keys on it. One was his truck. The other was brass, and it was newer than anything else in that envelope, and Ivy had held that ring in her hands a dozen times over 27 years, taking it off the dresser, moving it off the table, putting it back in his pocket after the wash. And she had never once known what that key went to, and she had thought, in the parking lot of the funeral home, holding this envelope, that she would probably just throw it out. The padlock at the back of the screen tower opened on the first turn, smooth, oiled, the way a lock opens when somebody has been keeping it that way. Ivy pulled the door. And the cold came out at her. It was the middle of October in the Carolina Piedmont, and the field behind her was 74 degrees and thick with the damp that never really leaves that country. And what came out of that doorway and across her face was cold and dry and clean and smelled faintly of vinegar and dust and machine oil, and Ivy Bledsoe stood in the doorway of what everyone she knew had spent their whole lives, calling a broken movie screen, and could not make her feet move. Somewhere in the dark to her right, something was running. A low, steady hum with a rattle in it. She found the switch. She had gotten good, by then, at finding switches in her husband's buildings. The room ran the whole width of the base of the tower, 40 feet long and maybe 12 deep, block on all 4 sides and a poured floor and a plank ceiling with the great steel skeleton of the screen sitting on it. And it was. And this was the thing that put her hand against the doorframe. Tidy. It was swept. There was a broom hanging on 2 nails. In a county where a woman had just spent 2 weeks cutting 38 years of varnished grease off a countertop, her husband had kept one room clean. Set into the block of the far wall, up high, was a window air conditioner, running. Below it sat a dehumidifier the size of a nightstand, running, its hose going out through a cord hole in the block and into the grass. On a shelf beside it stood 6 enamel trays of a blue-gray granular stuff that Ivy would learn, later, was silica desiccant, and a hot plate for drying it out and putting it back. Nailed to a post at eye level were a hardware store thermometer and a hygrometer, the kind you buy for $11 to hang in a greenhouse, and Otis had drawn a pencil line on the face of each one, and the needles were sitting on his lines. 52 degrees. 38%, and along both long walls, floor to ceiling, on steel shelving he had bolted into the block himself, standing on end, spine out, in rows, in courses, numbered in white grease pencil on the rims in the same slow square block capitals as the card in the fuse box, were the film cans. Ivy did not count them that night. She counted them 11 days later with Hallie and a clipboard, and it came to 406. She walked down the room with her arms wrapped around herself in a cold that $14,000 had bought, and she read the rims. They were dated, every one of them, and beside every date was a word or two in grease pencil, and the words were not movie titles. Sept 1971, Fair/Midway, May 1979, Decoration Day, Antioch, Aug 1984, Mill 3rd Shift Gate. April 1991, Freetown Easter. Nov 1994, Last Shift. She stopped at that one and stood a while. The mill had closed in 94. Ivy had been at the window that day. She had cooked for 110 men who came through knowing it was the last plate she would ever hand them, and every one of them said, "Thank you, ma'am." And about half of them could not look at her, and she had gone home and sat in her car in the driveway for 40 minutes. She had thought about that day for 30 years. She had never once seen it. At the end of the room was a bench. 2 rewinds bolted down, a splicer, a light box, a can of cement, a pair of white cotton gloves folded flat, a Bell and Howell projector under a dust cover, and tacked to the block wall opposite it, square and taut and cleaner than anything else on 11 acres. A bedsheet. He had built her a room where she could watch. On the bench, squared to the edge the way he squared everything, was a book. Canvas covered, the size of a ledger, its spine lettered by hand in that same pencil. Bulletin. Ivy sat down on his stool and opened her husband's book, and what was in it was 32 years of a man's handwriting, and it read like a work log, and it was not a work log. Every page was a grid he had ruled himself with a straightedge. Real number. Date, footage, stock, and then a column he had headed, in his block capitals, note, and in that column, 1 line per reel, in pencil. For 32 years, Freetown Easter. Whole road turned out. D. Wilkes's daddy in the good hat. Colored school, last day. Miss Ida crying and pretending it was the wind. Bailey boy's funeral. Did not run this one. Gave the family a print. 3rd Shift Gate, August. They know. You can see they know. And at the end of every single entry, the same terse bearing. The way a man notes where a thing is stored, a wall, a course, a number. North 411, south 230, he had built a room and then he had built a finding aid for it. Because a thing you cannot find is a thing you did not save. Ivy turned back to the front of the book, to the first page, to entry number 1. And entry number 1 was not the county. Reel 1, Oct 6, 1984, 400 FD. Plus X, Mill Centennial Parade, Maine at Depot. And in the note column, in pencil, in her husband's hand, girl on the curb at Depot with her mother. Did not know her yet. Ivy read it 4 times. In October of 1984, she had been 27 years old. She had not met Otis Bledsoe until the spring of 1999 in the canteen, when he came through the line and asked for 2 pieces of cornbread instead of 1, and did not explain that either. 15 years. He had not known her. He had not known she existed. He was a 37-year-old man on the other side of Main Street with a camera on his shoulder, filming a parade for a newsreel he showed to a field full of cars on Saturday nights. And he had written that line about it, and the line was in the front of a book in a cold room he had paid for every month for 38 years. Bearing, south, 1. She got up. South wall. First course. First can. It was standing by itself. Every other shelf in that room was packed spine to spine, and this one had 1 can on it and nothing else. Alone, with 8 inches of clean steel on either side of it, and around the can was a paper band, and on the paper band in soft pencil, block capitals, Ivy. This one first. Run it before you run any of the others. It took her 2 hours to thread it. Her hands did not know how. She had watched him thread a projector 100 times through a lit window from a field, and had never once stood beside him while he did it. And now, she sat in his cold room with his threading diagram taped to the wall where he had left it for exactly this, and got it wrong twice, and said a word she had not said out loud since her mother was alive. And then the lamp came up, and the sprockets took hold, and the sound of it filled that block room like water filling a cup. That soft, fast, leathery clatter that every person in Aldrich over the age of 50 could hear in their sleep, and a square of white light landed on a bedsheet nailed to a wall. Numbers, leader, a flash of black, and then Main Street, in October, in 1984, in color, in the sun. The high school band came by, terrible and glorious, afloat with a paper cotton bowl the size of a car, men on the fire truck. And the camera panned, slow and steady the way Otis did everything, across the crowd on the far curb at Depot Street. And there, for 4 seconds, then 8, then the camera stopping on her because a young man behind a lens had seen something and not known what, was a girl of 27 in a red coat, laughing with her whole head back at something out of frame, one hand up to keep her hair out of her mouth. And holding on to that girl's arm, leaning in, saying something into her ear that made her laugh like that, alive, 62 years old, 6 weeks from the stroke that would take her out of the world on a Tuesday in December, was Ruby Teague, Ivy's mother. There were 4 photographs of Ruby Teague in existence. Ivy had them all. A wedding picture, 2 church supper snapshots, and a Polaroid gone orange. In all 4 of them, her mother stood still and looked at the camera and did not move, because that is what the dead do in photographs. They hold still forever, and after 41 years, Ivy had stopped being able to remember how her mother moved. She had lost it the way you lose a smell. She could not remember the walk. She could not remember the hands. On a bedsheet, on a block wall, inside a movie screen, on a bypassed highway, in a room that cost $31 a month, Ruby Teague leaned in and said something into her daughter's ear, and laughed and put her hand up to her daughter's face and moved. Ivy Bledsoe made a sound in that room that she had never made before in her life. It ran 4 minutes. She ran it 11 times. Somewhere around the 6th or 7th, she went back to the bench and turned the bulletin book to the last page that had writing on it. Because she understood by then that there would be one, that he would not have left her without one, that he had been 3 years dead certain about every part of this. The last page was not a grid. It was 4 lines of pencil. "It's the tower, Ivy. It was always the tower. I found you in my own film in 2003 cutting down a reel for the Rotary, and I sat in this room by myself for an hour. I never could think how to say it, so I never said it. Your mother is on reel 1. That is the only one there is. Run reel 1, and then come up here and meet the rest of them. Nobody is gone while the reel is still turning." She called Hallie, because Hallie was the only one of them who had cried at the funeral. Cherie's girl, 22, worked the pharmacy counter in town, had a phone in her hand from the minute she woke up, and a way of filming everything that Ivy had always privately thought was a waste of a life. Hallie came out on a Sunday in a hoodie, expecting to help her step-grandmother move boxes, and Ivy walked her across the mown field and unlocked the back of the screen and opened the door and let the cold roll out onto her. Hallie Cantrell stood in that doorway for about 6 seconds. Then she said, "Oh my God," and then she said it again, and then she put her phone in her pocket, which Ivy had never once seen her do. "Nana," Hallie said, "do you know what this is?" Ivy said she was hoping somebody would tell her. They counted for 11 days, 406 cans, and Hallie read the bulletin book out loud from the stool while Ivy called the bearings off the shelves, North 411, South 230, and every entry matched. Every single one. 32 years and 406 times. A man's word and a man's shelf agreeing with each other in the dark. On the 9th day, Hallie stopped in the middle of an entry and did not go on. And Ivy looked over, and the girl was sitting on that stool with a canvas book in her lap, crying so hard she could not get her breath. And the entry said, "Freetown, Easter. Whole road turned out. D. Wilkes's daddy in the good hat." Hallie was the one who found Dr. Meredith Locke, because Hallie was 22 and it took her 40 minutes on her phone. The state archive gets, Locke said later, maybe 200 of these calls a year. Somebody's grandfather's film is in somebody's attic. She drove down out of professional courtesy and low expectation, 3 hours on a Thursday, and she said afterward that she had already written the letter in her head on the way, the kind letter, the one she wrote 40 times a year, the one that says we are so sorry, the material has advanced past the point of recovery. Because that is what happens. Acetate film does not last. It off-gasses acetic acid as it ages, and the acid eats the base, and the base buckles and shrinks and goes to a solid ring of amber junk in the can, and it is called vinegar syndrome, and it is not a maybe. It is a chemistry, and heat and damp are its accelerant. And there is no damper country on this earth in August than the Carolina Piedmont. Locke had learned to smell it from the driveway. She got out of her car at the Brightleaf and looked at 11 acres of mown broomsedge and a 60-foot ruin with its face peeling off in dinner plates, and she thought, in her own words, "Well, here we go again." Then, a 69-year-old woman in an olive-field jacket opened a steel door at the back of it, and Meredith Locke walked into 52 degrees and 38% and stopped dead in the middle of the floor. She did the strips first. She had a box of them in her bag. Little paper AD strips, acid detection. You drop one in the can and seal it and come back in a day and read the color. Blue is clean. Green is trouble. Yellow is a funeral. She had brought 30. She had to send Hallie to town for a printer cable and drive back to Raleigh the next week for more, because there were 406 cans, and Meredith Locke tested every one of them. 406 blue. Not one green. Not one. She sat down on the poured floor with her back against the block, a 44-year-old woman with a doctorate, in a movie screen on a bypassed highway, and she started to laugh. And then she stopped laughing. She asked Ivy how long the air conditioner had been running. Ivy said since the summer of 1988. Locke asked what it cost. Ivy said an average of $31 a month. And Meredith Locke said the sentence that Ivy would hear repeated back to her, in one form or another, for the rest of her life, in the paper, in a courtroom, in a lecture hall in Chapel Hill 2 years later, where Ivy sat in the front row in a good dress and did not entirely follow the rest of it. Locke said, "Ma'am, I work for an institution that lost a third of its nitrate holdings in the 70s because we could not get the money for a chiller. Your husband had a 9th grade education, a window unit, an $11 hygrometer, and a pencil, and he held this material at 52 degrees and 38% for 38 years without missing a month. There are 3 state archives in this country that could not have done what is sitting in this room. The reason this exists is the electric bill your family laughed at." Then she asked what was on it. And this is where the story stops being about Ivy Bledsoe, because what was on it was Aldrich. All of it. The Brightleaf Bulletin, 3 minutes of the county's own news, shot by Otis all week and shown to a field full of cars every Saturday night between the cartoon and the feature, from 1966 until the screen went dark in '88, and then, when there was nobody left to show it to, shot anyway, by a man alone with a Bolex, until 1998. The Fair, Decoration Day at Antioch. 600 Friday night ball games. The mill's last shift in '94. 110 men coming out of a door for the last time, and at the end of the reel, for 9 seconds, a window with a woman in it, handing out plates. And Freetown. Freetown was 40 houses, a church and a 2-room school on the east side of Aldrich, and in 1991 the 4-lane came through and took every bit of it. And the people who lived there were paid and moved and scattered to Charlotte and Greensboro and the far side of the river. And the county built an interchange on top of it. There is no historical marker. There are, in the county library, in the state archive, in the newspaper's morgue, precisely 4 photographs of Freetown, and 3 of them are of the highway construction. Otis Bledsoe filmed Freetown for 25 years. Its Easter parade every single year. Its school's last day. Its church, inside and out, 3 months before they took it down, with the light coming through the windows and Miss Ida at the piano. Dorcas Wilkes was 81 years old and lived 9 miles away and had not seen her father's face move since 1974. Hallie drove out and got her. They ran it for her on the bedsheet in the cold room. Dorcas Wilkes sat in a folding chair inside a movie screen and watched a road she grew up on go by in the sun in 1971 and said nothing at all for 4 minutes, and then put her hand flat on her chest and left it there. Nobody in that room said anything for a while. Then Dorcas said, and Ivy wrote it down afterward on the back of the chest freezer warranty because she did not want to lose it. They told us there was nothing there. 40 houses and a church, and they built a road over it, and they told us there was nothing there. And a white man nobody could get 2 words out of has had us in a box in a wall for 34 years. Cold, so we wouldn't spoil. The county paper ran it the next Wednesday, front page above the fold, with a picture of Ivy standing at the back of the screen tower with her hand on the open door. Mac Bledsoe read that paper on a Wednesday morning. He called a lawyer on Wednesday afternoon. The filing came 11 days later, and it was. Curtis Pate said, reading it in his office with his glasses down his nose, about what you would expect from a man who had never in his life valued a thing he could not sell. It made 2 arguments. The first was that the will gave Ivy 11 acres and the structures standing upon it, and that 406 cans of film were not a structure and were not standing upon anything. They were, Mac's lawyer wrote, tangible personal property of the estate. Chattel, no different from a set of golf clubs, and as such they fell into the residuary and were divided 3 ways, and since Mrs. Bledsoe had taken the position that the collection was of extraordinary value, the estate would require its sale and the distribution of the proceeds. The second argument was that Otis Bledsoe had redrawn his will 3 years before he died, at 76, and had left his widow a derelict theater and his children a house, and that this was on its face the act of a man of diminished capacity, and that the whole instrument should fall. They wanted it both ways, which is how you can always tell. If Daddy wasn't thinking, the will was bad. If the will was good, the film was theirs anyway. Ivy read it twice at the counter of the concession stand, and then went out and sat on the hood of her husband's truck in the mown field, and looked up at the screen for about an hour. What she felt was not what she expected to feel. She had expected the flat, cold clarity. Instead, what came up was something closer to embarrassment on their behalf, and then, under that, a kind of hard, bright joy. Because Ivy Bledsoe had spent 11 days in a cold room reading a dead man's handwriting, and she knew something about Otis that his son had never bothered to learn in 51 years, which was that Otis Bledsoe never in his life did a thing by accident. She went and got the book. The hearing was in December, in the old courthouse on the square, in a room with radiators that banged. It was set for a morning. It ran 2 days, because the county came. Curtis Pate went first, and Curtis Pate was not a dramatic man, and that is exactly why it worked. He testified that Otis Bledsoe had come into his office on a Tuesday 3 years back, and had sat down and had told him what he wanted, and had not asked his advice about any of it. He testified that he had drafted the Brightleaf clause to read the 11 acres, the structures standing upon it, and the contents thereof, which was how you wrote it, which was how he had written it 400 times. And he testified that Otis Bledsoe had read it and had put it down on the desk, and had said no, and had asked for the pencil. And that in the margin of that draft, in block capitals, the client had written the words he wanted, and had made his lawyer put them in over his lawyer's objection that they were inelegant and unnecessary, and had come back the following Tuesday to check that they were still there, and every last thing stored inside them, whatever it turns out to be. Pate laid the marked-up draft on the clerk's table. Mac's lawyer objected to it, and was overruled and objected again. Ephraim Sills testified in the afternoon. In a clean shirt, badly, he could not be got to say more than 9 words at a stretch. Mac's lawyer asked him whether he had any personal knowledge of Mr. Bledsoe's mental state, and Eve thought about it a while, the way he thought about everything, and said, "Well, he paid me $40 every 3rd Saturday for 30 years, to mow 11 acres of weeds, and he told me don't let anything get up against the tower, and I never did know why, and now I do." The lawyer said that was not responsive. Eve said, "You asked." Meredith Locke testified on the second morning with a folder, and it took 11 minutes to take the capacity argument apart, and she did it without once raising her voice, because she did not have to. She put up the readings. She put up the strips. She explained vinegar syndrome to a courtroom in Aldrich, North Carolina, and every person in it understood it. And then she said that maintaining a stable, cold, dry environment continuously for 38 years without one lapse required not merely capacity but sustained intention, a monthly act of will, 456 consecutive times. Then she said, "The gentleman is arguing that his father did not know what he was doing. His father knew what he was doing every month for 38 years. I would like the court to consider which of those 2 men has demonstrated a plan." And Dorcas Wilkes testified last, because Hallie asked her to and because Ivy asked her to, and she took a long time getting up to the chair, and she did not talk about the film at all. She said she was 81. She said she was born on a road that is not there. She said her school is not there, and her church is not there, and her father's house is not there, and there is an off-ramp on top of all of it, and there is not one sign, not one, nothing, that says anybody ever lived there. She said she had spent 50 years telling her grandchildren about a place they had every right to believe she had made up. Then she said, "They are asking you to sell my daddy." She said, "You can put a price on it if you want to. Somebody will pay it. But you need to understand what it is you are pricing, because it is not a movie. It is the only place my father is still walking." The radiators banged. Nobody moved. And Cherie Bledsoe Cantrell, who had signed on to her brother's filing because it was easier than the phone call it would have taken not to, and who had spent 2 days sitting behind him with her hands in her lap, stood up in the middle of a hearing she was a petitioner in, and said to the judge, in a voice that came out wrong, that she wished to withdraw. Mac turned around and looked at his sister. And Cherie said the truest thing anybody said in those 2 days, and she said it to her brother, not to the court. She said, "Mac, he left it to her, because she's the only one of us who'd have gone and looked." The judge took it under advisement, which is what judges say when they already know. The screening was Hallie's idea and Hallie's doing, and it happened on a Saturday in April, on the first warm evening of that year, and Ivy did not have to do one thing about it, except say yes. Meredith Locke would not let them run the originals. She was pleasant about it, and she was immovable. The material had survived 38 years because nobody ran it, and she was not losing a foot of Freetown to a sprocket on a night out. So the state scanned it, and struck a print, and the print is what went in the booth, and Eve Sills and a retired lineman named Potate and 2 men from the fire department spent 4 weekends waking a carbon arc projector that had not thrown a picture since the summer of 1988, and on the 4th weekend, it lit. And Ivy Bledsoe had to go stand behind the concession stand for a minute. They expected 60 cars. 411 came. They came down Old Highway 9 from 6 o'clock on, and Eve parked them in rows with a flashlight. People on truck tailgates, and people in folding chairs, and people who had driven up from Charlotte and over from Greensboro because a cousin had called them. And Dorcas Wilkes sat in the front row in a good coat with 11 of her family around her. And at about 8:15, when it was full dark, a 69-year-old woman climbed the steel stairs to the booth her husband had climbed for 55 years, and put her hands on the machine and threaded it right the first time. And the light went out across 11 acres and hit the screen. Aldrich sat in the dark and watched itself. They watched the fair in 1971. They watched their ball teams. They watched 110 men come out of a door in November of 1994 for the last time, and half the field could not breathe. They watched their mothers young. They watched a road that is not there anymore, in the sun, on Easter, with everybody out, and a tall man in a good hat coming down the middle of it with a little girl on his shoulders. And when that man came up 60 feet tall on a peeling screen in the middle of a field, 411 cars blew their horns at once and did not stop for a long while, and Dorcas Wilkes stood up in the front row with her hand over her mouth and watched her father walk. The judge was in row 11 with his window down. Nobody had asked him to come. He ruled in 9 days, and it was 3 pages, and the operative part of it was 1 sentence, that the testator had written the words, whatever it turns out to be, into his own instrument in his own hand for the express purpose of foreclosing exactly this argument, and that the court declined to be the instrument by which a man's plainest intention was defeated. The rest came after, and the rest is the smallest part of this story, and Ivy would tell you so herself. The State Archive took stewardship, and the cans went to Raleigh in a refrigerated truck and came back as scans and stayed at the Brightleaf as originals, in the cold room, because Ivy would not let them go, and Locke, in the end, did not argue, because the room was better than the room she had. A preservation foundation paid to scan all 406. A documentary licensed 9 minutes of Freetown, and a university paid more, and the county, which had never given Otis Bledsoe so much as a plaque, put up a marker at the off-ramp with the name of a road on it. Ivy took none of it personally. She was 69. She had a cot in a snack bar and a field and a book. Mac came out to the Brightleaf once, that summer, alone, in the evening. He stood in the gap in the fence a long time before he came in. He did not apologize, because he was not a man who could get his mouth around it, and Ivy did not require him to be, because she had spent 31 years handing plates to men like that, and she knew that what they bring you, instead of the words, is the only apology they have. What Mac brought was a photograph out of his wallet, soft at the corners, of a boy of 9 standing beside a projector with a man's hand on his shoulder, and he held it out and said, "He never let me touch it." Ivy looked at it a while. Then she said, "Well, come up in the booth then, I'll show you." She still lives there. There is a proper roof on the concession stand now, and a proper little apartment behind it, and the marquee frame out front is still empty, because Ivy likes it empty. They run pictures on Saturdays in the summer, and the county comes, and the money from that goes to the film. Evesil still mows, and still takes $40, and has flatly refused every raise. And once a year, in October, on the first cold Saturday, Ivy Bledsoe walks out across a field the whole county used to call weeds, and opens a steel door at the back of a movie screen and lets the cold roll out over her, and takes one can down off the south wall, first course, first shelf, where it sits by itself with 8 inches of clean steel on either side of it, and carries it up to the booth, and threads it with hands that know how now, and stands at that little window in the dark, alone, and runs 4 minutes of a parade in 1984. And a girl of 27 in a red coat laughs on a curb at Depot Street with her whole head back, and her mother leans in and says something in her ear and puts a hand up to her face and is alive. Ivy never did find out what her mother said. There is no sound on it. She has decided she does not need to know. They gave her 11 acres of weeds and a broken movie screen, and they were not being cruel. Not exactly. They were being accurate, according to the only way of counting any of them had ever learned. And a quiet man who never once explained himself had spent 38 years and $14,000 in electricity, $31 at a time, keeping the damp out of it and the grass down around it, so that on some evening after he was gone, the one person he was sure would go and look would open that door and find the whole county waiting in the dark, and her mother at the front of it. First shelf, first course, still moving. Nobody is gone while the reel is still turning. He said it once a year from that window for 27 years, and she thought he was talking about the movies. Somewhere behind you there is a person whose quiet work is still holding you up, and you have probably never said their name out loud to anybody. Say it now, put it in the comments, and tell us what they kept, and what it cost them, and whether they ever told you. We read every one of them. And if this one kept you company tonight, stay with us. There is another one next week. Thank you for sitting all the way to the end of it. The light's better back here anyway.